everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO at Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Today, my guest is Stephan Meier, and Stephan is the chair of the management division and the James P. Corman Professor of Business Strategy at Columbia Business School. He grew up in Switzerland. He has an MA in History, Economics, and Political Science, and he has been teaching and researching at Columbia for 15 years. And he's going to share with us some of his views and thoughts and experiences. So welcome aboard today, Stephan.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So world according to me, which may or may not be accurate, there's a subset of thought leaders that are academics. That's kind of where you fit. So tell me how that sort of happened, because not all academics expand their horizons to delve into thought leadership. So tell me a little bit about that journey, those experiments.
Right. Thank you so much. So, I mean, it was indeed kind of a journey, and like some of the steps along my career kind of informed me about, how I want to bring kind of the research that I do to inform leaders and policymakers more broadly. And the first step after I finished my PhD, I actually left academia. So I went to the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston. So I worked in the Federal Reserve System here in the US and was at the Center for Behavioral Economics and Decision Making. That was a newly formed center. I'm not a macroeconomist, so
Right.
don't ask me anything about like inflation. And I can only give you kind of the Business Week version of that. But I know a lot about kind of, how people make decisions, what biases they have, and how mistakes happen. And so while I was at the Fed, I really saw kind of firsthand that, how important it is to have like evidence-based policy making, and that it's important to like, shape kind of how leaders think. And so that's kind of my first array into thinking about thought leadership, taking my knowledge that I know from my research and expanding it outside. And then I chose to come to the business school here at Columbia. And same thing, like while I spend a lot of time in my office doing just research, thinking about with myself,
Right.
like writing it in academic papers,
Yeah.
but I got really passionate about bringing that outside of my office into the classroom, but then also beyond the classroom, thinking about how can I help leaders across the globe
Well,
to just be
can you
better
give an
versions of themselves.
example? Give an example, because one thing that's really, really interesting is, as a discipline, as a science, behavioral economics is fairly young, right? Maybe 30 years, 40 years, something like this. Doesn't go back to Adam Smith, right?
Right.
And was really at some level an admission that economics isn't perfect. This concept of rational man and all this other stuff, that there is psychology involved, that people do weird things, that people do sort of unpredictable things that are
Yeah.
not in their self-interest economically. So talk about sort of the difference between teaching those concepts to students and now going out into, let's call it, the real world, into the business world,
Right.
and doing some applied stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Like the beauty about economics and the standard economics, it's relatively straightforward.
Yeah.
Like people are like in a certain way, they behave relatively predictable, they're rational. We kind of have those models where we predict, oh, people react to X, Y, and Z and whatever. The beauty of that is it's very easy to make predictions. The not so nice beauty about what is not so nice is that it's often wrong. Like people are actually not perfectly rational. And so when you then go into the area of behavioral economics and bring psychology in, it gets messy because humans are complicated. And so that's what I try to do, then kind of helping in this realm where like we think like sometimes it's like, this is like really random what people are doing, bringing still some structure into how do we behave in this, human way that is still predictable. Because if it's just random, there's very little we can do.
That being said, you alluded to that you're bringing this into, organizations, corporations. What's an example of an opportunity where a company, not an institution, brought you in to say, hey, Stefan, help us figure this thing out?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm doing like basically related kind of two things that I'm mainly focusing on. Like what motivates people. So, like how to think about incentives in those areas. So, I'm teaching also at the business school in exec ed opportunities, where I bring in where leaders come in and I tell them about like can we think about monetary incentives? And how can we think about when they work, when they don't work? I now expanded this quite significantly, and that's related kind of to my newest book, which is called The Employee Advantage, which kind of thinks about how do people behave and how can we humanize work in order to make the organization more profitable and more successful.
Stay there for a minute, though.
Yep.
So the data tells us and has told us for quite some times that people do respond primarily to intrinsic rewards, motivation, etc. Yet, I would argue, maybe I'm wrong, tell me if I'm wrong, most organizations, most companies got the memo, yet their compensation systems, their reward systems and all that are still largely, not 100%, but primarily extrinsically. I will pay, if Stefan's miserable, I'll pay him more and he'll stay. Well, maybe he wants to work from home 2 days a week. Like, how come that reaction to the data still gets them to think to stick to an old way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're so right, Peter. Like while I mean, I've never met an executive that I talked to would say like people only care about money, but the actions they take kind of reflect that notion that they think like, oh, people would switch job if there is $10,000 more, they're all about
Yeah.
the compensation. And they kind of neglect or not focus enough of those other factors that really motivate people. So
Well, I mean,
what I,
so I would say that, at some levels, right, if I was working at Starbucks for $15 an hour and Dunkin' Donuts across the street offered me $10,000 more. Yeah, the $10,000 relative to the total income is huge, right? So in that case, it would be. But in most instances, assuming that 10K is not 30% of their earnings or something like that, that's not going to happen. So if that's true, I would argue that the organizations are acting in a way that's not economically sound, right? If you knew that it was better to it's cheaper to motivate people intrinsically mostly than to throw another 20,000 bucks at them.
yeah, no, absolutely. I think like it is really, I think, and the evidence is relatively clear. I mean, you're absolutely, on the lower end of the income distribution, income obviously is very, very important. Having more money makes a huge difference in their lives and also in their productivity. So actually is also good for the
Yeah.
organization to keep to create kind of that secure financial security that like
Yeah.
those individuals want. But once you reach a certain level, it's much more about this. The problem a little bit is like if I would ask you right now, think about a way to motivate people with money. I mean, you need 15 seconds to come up
Yeah.
with like I increase it by like whatever. I create a bonus, whatever. It's a relatively easy, well understood mechanism. So, but the other one, think about like how can you motivate people when you think about autonomy? That's a motivator that people have flexibility, autonomy. Now come up with a good scheme on actually make that happen. Now that's much, much harder because there's trade-offs involved,
Yeah.
but I actually think it works better. So what I try to do now with organization is like creating kind of workshop style where they think about those motivators that are the research is pretty clear that motivate people beyond money, and for them to come up with ways of actually now implementing this in their organization.
If you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership,
Please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave a 5-star review at ratethispodcast.com/LTL and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcasts and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcast. So, you mentioned earlier, oh, well, if everybody does X, they get a 10% raise, or I can come up with a bonus scheme or whatever it is, right? And number one is that assumes everything's equal because money is equal. A dollar in your pocket is
Yes.
the same as a dollar in my pocket. So if I come up with these schemes that are money is the answer to everything, it's a one size fits all approach, right? So you mentioned autonomy. Well, if we knew that this subset of people in our company, autonomy is really important. Yet for this subset of people, they want to be more collaborative, whatever the things are. So I think you actually have to design lots and lots of things, right? That
That's
are
absolutely yeah, that's absolutely right. You have to personalize it more. And so the analogy I sometimes use, which like bring hammers kind of that point down, is the employees are kind of the new customers. So let's talk about customers for a second. If you think about customer centricity,
yes.
and let's ask customers what they care. Now, an important part what they care is the price.
Yeah.
Don't know whether it's top or is somewhere. Now, customer centricity is not lowering the price.
Mhm.
Customer centricity is figuring out what does Peter actually care about? What does really make his experience better? And your experience is going to be different than what I care about in
Sure.
my experience.
Sure.
And so it's this personalization aspect that led to customer centricity. And it's not lowering price. In fact, it's increasing price afterward. The whole idea is like
Right.
to make the experience better for you. And I'm totally with you. That has to be like it's individual. You care about certain things in your customer experience that I don't care, and vice versa. And the same is now true for employees. If you think about employees and employee centricity, this is not about increasing the wage. It's about improving the experience. And you're absolutely right. The experience that you care is very different from mine. There are
So
some
that being said, based on the book then, there's a whole body of work on customer experience, there's a whole body of work on employee experiences, lots of things. What is the employee advantage? How are you defining that? Because it's an interesting concept. What is it? And why should I consider embracing it as a
yeah.
leader?
Yeah, I mean, how I define it is like it's really putting your employees first, really caring about the experience that the employees have.
But
Uh,
that sounds like a poster with all due respect in the lunchroom.
yes,
We care about our people are not like
true.
what really how would I know if I'm doing it well?
Well, I think you're doing it well if you really get like engagement. If you look at, I'm absolutely with you. I've never met an executive who doesn't say, I don't care about my employees. I mean, they're all think
Well,
that's
they
like the
do
most.
think oh, but they'll do things that line up to that being the outcome, but they'll never say
Yes.
out loud, "I don't
Yes, they never say that, but, like,
Yeah.
if you actually look into the engagement levels, either is, like, they're lying or they don't know how to do it. Could be both. Could be
But
they
there that
care.
means that employee engagement scores, when you look at Gallup and all that, have in essence been flat for as long as they've been measuring them.
Yeah,
So, if
and miserable.
if I was on a diet for 5 years and I was still overweight, I would eventually say, "Something's wrong with this diet."
Yes. Yeah, so the engagement levels are constantly low. They're actually low for, like, a decade or more, or even more. And so that's exactly where the work happens because I do think we're now moving into a area where, like, it becomes more and more important to care about the employee experience. And it's the same with customers, I've never met anybody who says, like, "I don't care about my customers." They all obviously do, but only few companies can actually pull it off to
So
be employee-centric.
give me an example or 2 of things that a company that embraces the thinking of employee advantage would be doing versus one that's not.
Yeah. Okay. So let me start with an example that again starts with the customer that shows this.
Okay.
Amazon, Bezos at Amazon, very customer-centric organization, not as employee-centric, but they're very customer-centric. And when asked about what is so great about his customer, Bezos said in one quote, I mean, has many quotes, but in one quote says like, the amazing thing about customer, they're very unhappy all the time. And what he means, and so what he means with that is like, I can always learn how to get better. Now, turn this around for employees. is like very few people say like what is great about my employees is they're unhappy. But like the same logic applies. If I actually listen to my employees, I can constantly improve. So I think employee-centric organizations take this very, very seriously and have mechanisms in place how to get like inputs from their employees and constantly improve. I mean, this is not a new concept in general. You know, the Toyota way, the
Right.
is exactly that. Like getting mechanisms in place so that frontline workers actually have input that improve the process. And as a result, the organization is going to be better off. And so the really employee-centric organizations do that really, really well. That's one example, like listening.
Apply that to 10 plus years ago, and I'm not picking on Google, but just use that as an example. Google, one of the things they were known for when we were in a come to work environment more was, oh my God, the amenities. There's, you can get sushi and you can get your drive and you can oh my God, this sounded like the greatest resort. But when you looked under the hood, it was really math that said, listen, if you're a $300,000 engineer and for $5 or $10, I can underwrite your lunch and get another hour's work out of you. That's just a good investment if I'm Google.
Yeah, that's true. Although I actually am a little critical about those amenities. You know, I call those ping pong table solutions. So where like nobody, well, very, very few people leave an organization or join it because there is free lunch or there is a ping pong table or a kombucha tap. People leave organizations because, the manager is bad.
Yeah.
And so that's or the work environment, or they don't learn anything new. And that's why they really leave. And those quick fixes are just not doing much, in my opinion. So
Well, I think you're right because back when WeWork was a thing, you would go to our WeWork office in New York, Seattle, Miami, whatever. And it was like, oh, wow, they've got beer on tap. And on Tuesdays, it's pina colada, like whatever it was. Like, that's really cool. And then the reality is, if I want a beer, wouldn't I rather just go home and have a beer? Like,
yeah,
am I going to pay $1,000 more a month in rent because I can grab a beer? It just seemed silly.
absolutely. So you have to do much more, and which is a good thing. Hard is actually good because hard means you can differentiate from your competition. If it's like just everybody needs a ping pong table or a beer tap, I mean, just get a beer tap. Let it get a ping pong tap. I mean, that's cheap if that's really the kicker, but it is not. It's the hard work. So going back to what I said before, like having a mechanism in place to listening, getting inputs from your worker and constantly improve, that's hard, but that actually makes the real difference. Or another example would be, why people often leave jobs is because they don't learn anything new. They're stuck. And
Well, that's an interesting piece because you look at the friction between the organization. It says, while Stephan is a really good whatever accountant, and yes, you might be really good based on your productivity, the amount of work you can get done, whatever. But if you're not learning, you're bored, and therefore you're stagnant. So individually, you're in conflict with the organizational. Eventually, you're either going to grind it out or say, "Oh, I got to go somewhere else. I can't."
yeah,
Same thing.
yeah. It's you're hitting the nail on the head. I mean, that's part of the problem. Like let's say you're in my team. Now, Peter is like my best worker. I mean, he's really what he does really well. Why would I let you go somewhere else, learn something new? Because like what you're doing is really valuable to me. So it needs to change kind of the mindset in the organization because eventually you're going to leave the organization. So it hurts the organization, including my team. So you need mechanisms in place to allow for like Peter and Stephan, to learn something new and like get constantly stimulated and have what I call like those just right tasks, where you always have like tasks that are ideal for your skills, but you constantly want to learn new skills and new tasks.
Love it. Well, this has been great. I really, really appreciate you coming on today, and the conversation's been fantastic. So thank you so much, Stephan.
Thank you so much for us, Peter.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.